Hi, everyone, and welcome to episode 251 of the Medieval Podcast. I'm Danièle Cybulskie, also known as the 5-Minute Medievalist. When people talk about crusaders, lots of associated words come up to describe them. Everything from holy to cruel, from heroes to fanatics. It's rare, though, that anyone would ever flat out say garden variety criminals. But if you were living in the Holy Land during the time of the Crusades, criminals might just be the first word you thought of. This week, I spoke with Dr. Steve Tibble about Crusader Criminals. You may remember Steve from his last visit to the podcast when we talked about the Templars' role and history in Britain. Steve is the author of the Crusader Armies, the Crusader Strategy Defending the Holy Land, and Templars, the Knights of Britain. His new book is Crusader Criminals, the Knights Who Went Rogue in the Holy Land. Our conversation on why there was so much crime committed by men who were supposed to be holy warriors and what people did about it is coming up right after this. Well, welcome back, Steve. It is always great to see you. Welcome back to the podcast.
Yeah, it's lovely to be back, Danielle, and thanks for having me.
We've already been chatting for forever, but now we've turned on the microphones. It's time to get to work. All right.
Oh, damn. Yeah. Good.
So I've been thinking a lot about the Crusades lately because for my mini-series, This is History, The Iron King, I just did an episode dropped not too long ago about the Templars. So I've been thinking about the images of Crusaders and things like that. And it seems very important to people who were writing back then and now to still make them look good. And your book does not make Crusaders look good. So why did you write this book about the Crusades?
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's a really good question. I didn't set out to make anybody look bad. And I should stress it's called Crusader Criminals, but it's about criminals in the era of the Crusades, really. So it's a kind of equal opportunity look at the Crusades, and the criminals are everywhere, every ethnicity, every community, It's a tour of the bad boys of the Middle East in the 12th and 13th centuries. So it doesn't have a political aim to try and make anybody look bad or good. There is a kind of bigger reason why I set out to write it, because if you think of it, Crusader Criminals is a kind of an odd title. It's an odd bit of content, because it tries to look at sociology adjacent to the normal stuff. And it's partly because, like you, I've written a fair number of books, and I tend, like most people, to be quite event-driven. So you see, it's almost a horizontal view of history, and the old joke, like history is just one thing after another. Well, that's really what we do, isn't it? Much of the time. And there are good reasons why we do that, because we're following the evidence and the chronicles written by people who are not necessarily very strategic, or maybe haven't left the cloisters of the monastery in a decade. They tend to just look at the events. They look at the battles, the weddings, the deaths and funerals, the births. It's a horizontal link of around the middle of humanity, in a sense. And what I thought with this would be more interesting for me anyway was, and I hope for other people, is to look above and below simultaneously. So look at the kind of macro history, the macro elements, the things that people aren't even aware of, but they're facing the consequences. And then look at the micro stuff, which is, almost like the sociological consequences of all the bigger things that are happening, and then try and find the connections between the two. So that the overarching themes, I know we'll come on to that in a second, are how very modern themes like climate change and uncontrolled migration and consequences that had for the societies, how that impacted on everyday life and levels of criminality, and just whether people could feel comfortable walking down the street or going into a pub or whatever. And to me, it's a very interesting kind of vertical way of looking at history that I don't normally get the opportunity to do. So I had a whale of a time doing it. Really enjoyed it.
I'm glad.
Yeah,
okay.
Well, that's the important thing, isn't it?
Yeah, I'm thinking about Peter Frankopan is doing that kind of work too. In his latest book, he's looking at the macro stuff, because it's interesting when you think about it, because medieval people are always thinking about being influenced by the cosmos and by God and demons and angels and things like that. But so often, like you're saying, we look almost at that little box, the almost social media box inside the phone, where it feels like that's everything that's happening. But when you look outside, there's so many outside influences. And I think that looking at that is an important way to understand human social behavior. So what are some of the influences that you're looking at here to get into the small human actions that come out of it?
Do you mean the criminality? Looking at how criminality?
I'm looking at what are the big factors that you mentioned.
The big factors, absolutely. Yeah. It's like everything in life, really. It's the same nowadays. The big factors are so big in the nature of it that they're often invisible. We're very lucky these days that we do have 1,000,000 times of the resources available to our states that the Crusader states or their neighbors had. So we can actually, in theory at least, see things coming, react, plan, strategize. We don't. We're rubbish at it. We really should be ashamed of ourselves because we don't have the excuses they had. They couldn't see it coming and they didn't have any resources and they still did a good job. We often just have politicians who talk nonsense about strategy and about the big picture, and actually they're just waiting for the next election. So I don't think we've got anything to be smug about at all. But I know when you look at the Crusades and the medieval environment, the poor chaps there, they didn't even know what, they had a very rudimentary idea of geography. They had no idea of meteorological kind of influences, weather systems, and so on. And in previous books, I have had a couple of books looking at the strategy behind the Crusades, what caused the Crusades and how people responded to that militarily. And the primary movers are two consequences, one big mover and one big consequence. The primary mover is climate change. You can just see in the 2 centuries running up to the Crusades, the number of famines and droughts and so on are just enormous. And normally the Middle East, it's kind of the breadbasket of the ancient world. That's why so many civilizations, so much of humanity originated in that tiny part of the world. And it's very largely because they have this kind of weird meteorological system where they have a fail-safe. So there's the climate systems of the Eastern Mediterranean, and they do their own thing. They're normally fine. Occasionally there's a famine or two, drought, people suffer. But there is this second system, which is a kind of a fail-safe, which is the Nile Delta. And the climate and the productivity of the Nile Delta isn't affected by those same Eastern Mediterranean weather systems. It's actually affected by weather systems in Africa. So you've got this kind of fail-safe. Normally, both of them are fine. If one fails, particularly if one fails in the Eastern Mediterranean, there's enough fertility in the region for people to not be starving in the street. And what you do find, ironically, we've got the chronicles, which tell us how the Eastern Mediterranean weather suffered in the run-up to the Crusades. So anecdotally, you know that's happening, but it's quite hard to prove. You haven't got quantitative data. But in Egypt, bizarrely, you do have quantitative data. You have the Nilometers, which have been tracking the fertility of the Nile for centuries, so since about 300. And you can see what was a drought and a famine every 50 years in the run-up to the Crusades is every 4 or 5 years. There's something very much dramatically different happening. And the two systems fail at the same time. And because of that failure, you have a kind of climate meltdown in the Western Eurasian steppes, which leads to the big consequence, Turkic tribes moving in off the steppes into the Middle East, attacking pretty much all the sedentary societies. And I think we get very Eurocentric and we think, it's all about Muslims and Christians. And it really isn't. It's about nomadic tribes who are desperate and haven't got anywhere else to go. And they're very militarily well equipped. These are very hardy, very powerful individuals and societies militarily, and they can just burst in and take what they need to take. And they do that against the Muslim sedentary societies every bit as much as the Christian ones. It just happens to be whoever's in the way. So after that happens, you then get the fight back from the local Muslim sedentary societies. You get the fight back from the Byzantines, and then the Byzantines call for a fight back from Europe. So you get the situation where two very modern things, climate change and migration, cause huge tsunami, a demographic tsunami that is just sucking in young people, young armed males in particular, into this tiny area. And if you look at who commits crimes, clearly that has political and military consequences. But from my selfish position writing this book, you think, okay, well, I understand what armies do. But what happens to societies when you've got this number of raw, young, dislocated, disinhibited, armed men in one area. They're not all employed militarily the whole time. They're not fighting the whole time. They're there for 200 years doing whatever ghastly thing, young drunken guys get up to when they've got daggers, and they're roaming and taking whatever they want. So it's taking the very big picture and then looking at the societal impact and how that affects somebody who wants to leave the village and go to the next village, and whether they're going to get there without being mugged and murdered.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's so important to look at these big picture views, because when it comes to the Crusades, especially, people are always looking for blame. Like, who could we blame for this? And when you think about it as being people are desperate for food and then things start to fall apart, then it becomes something that you can actually, I think, look at perhaps more objectively and not just be like, it's that person, it's their fault, that kind of thing.
Absolutely. You can. I mean, I enjoy writing these kind of linear histories, and they are lovely because their characters are so great.
Mm-hmm.
But equally, you can write a history of the Crusades without naming a single individual or without naming a single religion. I think you can explain it by looking at the bigger ultimate causes.
Yeah.
So we have great fun doing all this kind of event-driven stuff, but we shouldn't kid ourselves that that's the primary mover. And it's not. Looking at the lives of great women and men doesn't tell you about the consequences for normal people in their villages or, living in a gutter on the edge of town.
Mm-hmm. I think you've thrown down the gauntlet, though. I think there are a lot of people that are going to be like, can't we talk about...
Yes, it's all fun. I'm not saying it's not fun.
We'll see how many emails you get. Okay. So we're talking about criminality, and it is very gendered in this time and place. It has been sort of throughout human history, and it's really kind of important to dig into this because, this is one place where you're probably going to get pushback as well. So when we're talking about crime and how it falls into gendered patterns, let's just get that out of the way to begin with.
Yeah.
What are we looking at?
We're looking at something that's hugely gendered then and now. Probably has always been. I mean, crime statistics are notoriously difficult, even nowadays, just because of reporting differences, and they don't exist in this period. But if you just look at modern prison systems like the UK or the US, it's I think it's about 95, 90%, 96% of the prison population is usually young men. That is, pretty much it. Well, certainly male and vastly disproportionately young. And it's a reflection of pretty much what happened in the Crusades. If you actually think, where are all these people going? You've got people coming from as far afield as Ireland and the Atlantic coast. You've got guys from sub-Saharan Africa being drawn into Fatimid armies. You've got steppe chaps coming in from, the Chinese borders and everything in between. It's just this huge vortex pulling in people, but it's not people. It's young, male, armed. And when they get there, they're disinhibited because their families are left behind. They're the armed people and they're in a village and maybe nobody else has got any proper weapons. You just have to look at how young men behave under those circumstances. Pick up any paper and read about narco states in South America or, whatever might be sort of young soldiers in Africa in different movements. Wherever you look, it's young men behaving badly, often shockingly badly. The big difference with the Crusades, and the thing that I think makes it much worse, is the kind of ratcheting over time. Because if you think of something like a narco state, maybe then the drug guy dies and then there's a change of government and, 4 or 5 years later, it's different. Or say something like the war in Ukraine, you imagine it starts and at some point it's going to end and so on. It may be 2 years, it may be 3, maybe 5, whatever. But, there's going to be something finite. You read Jane Austen, you got wars going on, you wouldn't even know it. She barely even mentions it because they're in boxes and they're contained and they start and end. In the Crusades, for various sociological reasons and sometimes religious reasons, the wars never stopped. So for 200 years, you get occasional truce in some parts of the region at some times, but never a peace. People are so invested in this piece of territory and the spiritual possessions within it and the fact that it's sort of like a lot of land disputes nowadays. A good land dispute doesn't go on for a long time without everybody having some merit to their case. Mm-hmm. I mean, there are a lot of people who've got a claim to the Holy Land. And it's not that any are right or wrong. There are just different ways of looking at it, and there are different levels of how they view their own legitimacy. And it means that for 200 years, you just have this chronic warfare. And that chronic warfare is pulling in this vortex of young men, most of whom aren't fighting most of the time. they're hanging around and they're doing what young men do. You may be in a small tribe. Sometimes, people would hire a tribe for a campaign. What happens at the end of the campaign? Where do they go? I mean, do they go straight home? Do they pay some money into their pension and move on in an orderly fashion? I don't think so. A lot of them are just hanging around, exploiting whatever opportunities they can find and making a real nuisance of themselves.
Yes, it's very different from a regular military situation, which people in the Middle Ages recognized is a problem if you have bored soldiers who are armed and they have nothing to do. I mean, this is one of the reasons why you disperse them seasonally and bring them back when it's time, because you don't want to be responsible for all that. And so in the Crusades, in the Holy Land, there's nowhere to go because it's so long to get back. And if you leave, then, the enemy might take more territory. So you're just there collecting grievances.
Oh my God. Yeah, absolutely. And I think you've got this added kicker of cultural differences. So if you're a guy coming from the Chinese borders and you're raiding in northern Syria, you don't really have any big connections. You maybe don't have any, probably not a theological student. And particularly if people aren't of the same religion, you're very disinhibited. That combined with the unceasing nature of it for 200 years is kind of, it's like Mad Max territory, really. Yeah. It's like the Wild West in the Wild East for 200 years. And the impact that had on just everyday life, I think you can see reflected in the book in just the volume and horror of the crime stories, the true crime stories that are going on.
I think when it comes to medieval justice, people think that this is kind of how it is everywhere all the time, but it's definitely not. People are always making sure that, or trying to make sure that people come to justice, that they have some consequences. Usually it's fines instead of something corporal. So what's happening in the Crusades? Are people trying to put a leash on any of this crime?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, they're like us. They want to protect their families. They want to protect their property. So they do want justice. People want justice. And it's very important. It's one of the big defining characteristics of a good leader is that he can provide justice for his people. But the huge problem in the Crusader states and their neighbors is that these are very inefficient societies anyway. So they don't have a lot of spare cash lying around, almost nothing. Everybody's poor. All governments are under-resourced. And what little money they do have, 99% goes on the army or the navy if you have one, that kind of thing, or castles. Even Saladin in Egypt. Okay, so Egypt being the richest country in the region, very fertile because of the Nile Delta, loads of cash. They actually do have a cash economy. We know that his budget was something in excess of 95% going on the army. But it's even worse than that. Most of that other remaining 5% went on the navy and fortifications. So the idea that there's, groups of policemen wandering around and well-built prisons waiting to be filled or whatever, it's just not going to happen. I mean, particularly in Egypt, they couldn't do it. They tried. That's the closest they had to what we would see as an organized criminal justice system. But in most places, it was really much more brutal and, you had to make it visible. So it was about the appearance of justice as much as anything else, because it's a very thin facade. There's one very interesting aspect of that, I think, and that is a lot of people assume that the Crusaders were very intolerant and, imposing their views and trying to convert people. And it's very, very not, that is absolutely not true. And that's not because I think they were Mother Teresa or anything. They're not. They're not just nice guys out there doing charitable works. They don't do it because they can't. It's expensive to run a justice system is very expensive. And for instance, so you find with the Muslim communities, even in the Crusader states, they were told, okay, you can hold a court here. You all swear on the Quran. You do your own thing. And unless we get a lot of complaints, that'll be it, lads. They really just want problems to go away because they've got such big military problems. And the other thing is they don't want the local Muslim guys to be so annoyed that they pick up their sticks and walk off to a neighboring Muslim country. They actually want people to, till the fields or whatever you do to a field. I think you till it probably, but they want a lot of tilling going on. They don't want dead taxpayers. So there's this strange tolerance and an idea of trying to get to justice, but it's so expensive they can't do it. And that is actually one of the reasons why justice in some parts of the Crusader states is quite old-fashioned and very visible. I mean, it's because it's much cheaper to do that. And that's where you get into things like trial by combat.
I want to get into trial by combat in just a second, but I think that one of the things that you're getting at right now is that if all that money is going to the army, there isn't a social safety net. And so there is a lot of poverty, and that is causing a lot of this as well. So when you talk at the beginning of your book saying it's often the usual suspects, the usual suspects tend to be people who have no money and they have to find another way to get fed, or they're very angry because they have no money. And so they're taking it out on society. So, it's one of these problems is like self-perpetuating. If you don't have that safety net, you don't have justice, and you don't have people getting fed, it is going to be an absolute stew pot of crime.
Yeah, it's really primal stuff. I mean, you're absolutely right. It actually comes back to that prime consequence, mass migration. These were not people looking to move because they wanted an extended holiday by the Mediterranean. These were people who were starving to death. If they didn't, if their animals starved, then their kids would die. It's a very binary decision. So that's the ultimate form of poverty if you don't have enough food on the table for you and your family. And that kind of poverty also has consequences for the justice system as well, because this is a society where obviously it's a money society, but a lot of people don't have any money. So you can't, in Western Europe, you can impose a lot of fines rather than, cutting people's arms off or whatever. Often in this time in the Middle East, you had to do something big and brutal and visible because people couldn't pay fines. You either let them off with a tap on the wrist, or you had to do something ghastly. It was again, very, very binary stuff.
Yeah. I think you have one example in the book where somebody was stealing bread, so they tied him to a tent pole, but of course he escaped and he brought bread to his other friends. But like, you don't even have the resources to punish people, as you say, like quote unquote humanely by locking them up for a certain period of time. There's no resource for that. So anyway, you have a big section in the book about trial by combat. Tell us about this in the Crusader states.
Yeah, it's a funny one actually, and we're very lucky because we have a couple of prime examples. One written by an outsider, by a guy called Usama, who was a Muslim Shazari princeling. And he left a very detailed commentary on a trial by combat that he'd seen near Nablus. And you can't take these things at face value. I mean, Usama's writing, often he's got a kind of axe to grind when he's doing these things. But we do have a lot of corroborating evidence. So if you look at the Frankish law books, you can see, this guy's telling the truth. It's in fact amazingly accurate, given that he's an outsider and not living in the country. But he comes in, writes what he sees, and it's pretty much what you would expect, having read the Frankish law books. And what he saw was quite a sad story, really. I'm not really sure who was guilty and who wasn't. Basically, in the village, it looked like it was a mixed village, Muslim community and some Christians, and it was in part of the royal domain around Nablus, so it would have been ultimately under Christian control. But bandits came in and robbed the place. There was one person who was accused of having worked with them. The kind of inside man on the job, the heist, was this kind of elderly Muslim peasant. And he didn't help his case. And in fact, he may have been guilty. He may well have been guilty. He didn't help his case if he was innocent, because he instantly did a runner after the bandits had done their worst. So people did try and find justice. So to be an accomplice was deemed legally to be as bad as being the actual culprit. So his children were taken into custody. I'm not quite sure what custody means in this case, probably a dungeon in somebody's tower. We're not talking elaborate prison conditions here. So the guy, I guess he just hid in a cave for a while, and then eventually he came back because he was worried about his family. And he was put on trial. And it was really interesting to see how it played out. The lord, the viscount, who was in charge of the village, he's the nearest thing that we can see to a Frankish police commander, I guess. He would have had a couple of sergeants to help him. And sergeant, it's funny actually that we still use the word police sergeant, but obviously in the Crusades, a sergeant is also a kind of non-noble soldier. So that's where we get police sergeant from. But he does have these policing sergeants who help him. And they organize a trial by combat. And the lord of the village doesn't want to do the dirty work himself, obviously, doesn't want to get his hands dirty. So he nominates a champion. And this champion is a young guy who's the blacksmith. So he's a Frank crusader settler, who's actually sweet. It's quite sweet in a way. He's not keen on doing it either. And even Usama could realize that the guy hasn't got his heart in it. But they're given sticks and shields and so on, and they're kitted out for this ritual trial by combat. And you'll know the will of God and real justice because the guilty party will be killed. And obviously a bit crazy, but it was a cheap way of providing very visible justice. And you have this kind of horrendous fight, very, very brutal. It's kind of game of two halves. The old guy does well. I think he's quite skilled. So he does well in the first half of the match, but then he tires, and the young blacksmith, who's clearly very, physically powerful and he's got more energy, eventually gets the better of him. And you have this brutal grinding down until the guy's, I think his eyes are gouged out and, he's beaten to death. As part of this lovely, lovely system of justice. I don't know if you've ever seen Deadwood, but there's a wonderful, absolutely gruesome hand-to-hand combat thing in Deadwood, just people fighting. And if you ever think a fist fight or, fighting with sticks is not brutal, well, watch that and think of this story in Nablus. Then the poor old guy was taken away and he was hung for good measure. He was already dead, but the hanging, I think, is more about display. It's like creating a shop window for justice. And then everybody went home happy, apart from his family, I imagine, who were released from prison, and then life in the village just carried on.
Yeah. And the blacksmith, who had major PTSD for the rest of his life, Yeah.
Very did.
It's a terrible, terrible story. But I think it's a good one. I'm glad you had it in there, not because I particularly loved reading the brutal violence.
Grim, isn't it?
Yeah. But the blacksmith's hesitation, I think, in the way that the fight took so long because he really did not want to be there, I think speaks to that humanity and the fact that you have such a strange and awful, as you say, vortex of things that are happening at the same time. And, somebody might get swept up in it that really doesn't want to be there. He's not a professional soldier. He's a blacksmith, And so I think that it's an important example to have there, especially because I think when we think about trial by combat, we think about like big jousts and stuff. But, it even comes down to sort of a micro level too.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's interesting that there were rules in trials by combat for the positioning vis-a-vis the sun, because it gave an advantage. So it had to be when the sun was high. And this combat went on so long because the young guy didn't want to kill the old guy. The old guy clearly didn't want to be there at all. So there was that hesitance on both parties, and they had to shift the location and the orientation of the combat because the sun was changing. Literally, the sun was moving across the sky. They were taking so long. Yeah, it's quite sad. There is actually another trial by combat that I don't know if you've got time for another one. But
we do. Go for it.
Go on then.
Go on.
Well, this one is much more like the one you were just talking about. This is the more kind of Hollywood crime. There was a situation in Cyprus, but using the old Frankish law book. So this is just at the end of the Crusades. It's Frankish settlers, but they've retreated from Palestine and they're in Cyprus. And there was a situation where a marriage was not very happy, and the husband was a knight, and he was out of the house one day, and his wife was murdered, and the mother-in-law suspected foul play, and she wasn't going to take it lying down. And because she was a widow, as well as being the guy's mother-in-law, the king had to step in, because the king had a responsibility, as you know, to help widows and orphans. And that's where that phrase comes from. Mm-hmm. It's not just financial institutions that have to do it nowadays. So he appointed, when it came to court, that he appointed a champion, and they actually did have combat on horseback, and real Hollywood stuff, where the accused, the husband, had to fight this champion who was one of the squires of the king. And the squire was wounded, but the other guy, the husband, was felt to have got off worse. So he was found guilty. Now, again, you think this is obscene, isn't it? So it's like the will of God and the truth of a situation is determined by who won a joust. That's got to be crazy. But interestingly, because everybody believed in it, because they bought into it, it could actually produce the right outcome. So this guy, the knight, who hadn't even been in the building at the time, was being led away to be hung. And you think this is a major miscarriage of justice. And right before he's hung, he turns around and says, "It's a fair cop. You got me banged to rights. I actually hired somebody to do it so that I could swear that I hadn't done it myself." And then he went slightly more happily to be hung, and everybody knew that real justice had been done. So it's one of those crazy things where if a society believes in something enough, it really can deliver justice. I mean, clearly there's lots of cases where I'm sure it didn't, but I always think that's quite a nice one. And I'm waving a flag for the mother-in-law as well. Mother-in-laws get a bad press sometimes, but this one was just really going gangbusters for justice, and she wasn't going to let her daughter die with no justice to commemorate her. So yeah, she did the right thing. I think everybody did well there.
Yeah. Again, a very human story. Yeah. Apart from the victim, right?
Yeah.
But like the story where he's like, yeah, I hired a hitman because I wanted to be able to say I didn't do it and
Which
for everyone to
sweet,
believe me.
Yeah. But it's quite sweet. And in a way, that is very alien to us as well, because nowadays, I don't know personally, but nowadays, I imagine you hire a hitman because it's more convenient and you want an alibi. But in those days, it was a bit of that, I'm sure. But from what the guy said, it was about the fact that he could swear on the Bible, that his immortal soul wouldn't be damaged by having to lie on the Bible. And they, you and I maybe believe that, but I doubt it. You know what I mean? We don't really believe in our immortal soul and that it's in peril if we break an oath, whereas those guys really did. So that had a big impact on justice.
Yes. Well, and I'm thinking he probably wouldn't have confessed, if he wasn't just about to be hanged. They're just about to put the noose on him. And that's the time he needs his soul cleansed. He obviously cares about that. So he needs to confess so that he can go to heaven, which is like, another moral issue all on its own. But yeah, there's so many like people in this story that you can relate to on a human level, whether you like them or not. This idea that I want to be able to tell the truth. So I've done something shady,
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, he was probably in purgatory, even though that doesn't exist now. But yeah, no, if he didn't go to hell. But.
Let's hope that he got his just desserts, that guy. So I think people flipping through your book and the table of contents might be surprised that in a book about Crusaders, you have pirates. Why did you throw pirates in here?
I know you don't go into crusading and expect to have to do a lot of ha-ha-ing as you go along, but there's lots of ha-has. Well, it's sort of part of being the Wild West, the Wild East, and a lot of the outlaws of the Crusades were naval outlaws. And I think part of it is that we misunderstand the nature of the Crusader settlement out there. We call them the Crusader states, like they're kind of independent organisms and they've got their own cash flow and stuff like that. Whereas the big clue is what they called themselves, which was Outremer, the lands across the sea. So these are basically far-flung settlements that are dependent on the sea. If the sea lanes to Europe are destroyed or collapse, the Crusader states are just running on air in the tank. They're dead within a month or two. They get no reinforcements. They don't get cash. They don't get pilgrims. It really would just be the death of them. So it's one of those very counterintuitive things. On the one hand, you would think, okay, well, the Crusader states, Outremer, obviously hugely dependent on the sea. They must have the biggest navy in the region, you'd think. In reality, they've got zero navy and they never built one up. They never had a navy. And it's even more weird when you think that other people did. So the Egyptians had a really big professional navy. They could normally raise about 70 ships in theory, and for normal expeditions, somewhere between 30, 35, 40. And the Byzantines had a good navy. They had other things to do with it, and they were Christians, so they were normally sort of allies or, neutral. But occasionally, there were fights there. So you've got these Crusader states. They're completely dependent on the sea, and yet they did nothing about it. So I kind of looked into it, and I think piracy is a big part of the answer to that conundrum. How can a seafaring state survive without anything that goes to sea? Well, the answer is they had plenty of things that went to sea, but they were kind of freelancers. Mm-hmm. It's just a huge freelance thing. And I think one of the big differences is that we think of pirates and you think of, Johnny Depp and that whole thing of, guys with black beards and, tricorns and looking very dramatic. And I think these guys did look dramatic, but in a very different way. So when you think of Pirates of the Caribbean, you're thinking these are quite structured roles. There's the Royal Navy that Johnny Depp's fighting against. There are occasional privateers who are working alongside the Navy and because they've got papers to let them do it. And you've got merchant vessels who are carrying goods and people. And then you've got the pirates who are the kind of the outlaws, going around, doing what they do best. But there is quite clear job delineation there. You've got trade unions at work. There's my members, my pirate members, we can't go without them. But if you look in the medieval world, they don't have those distinctions. And there are an awful lot of ships in the Crusader ports. It's clear almost from day one. There's an English pilgrim called Seawolf who goes over, I think, very early years, just only 1 or 2 years into the Crusader states. And he tells a very sad story about how he landed at port. He just managed to get off the ship, but then loads of people died. Thousands of people died, and I think nearly 100 ships were lost. And you can read that and then not really understand what you're looking at. But what it means is, apart from the disaster of it, it's like at any given point in any little port on this seaboard, before the Crusader states were even properly settled, there were hundreds of vessels. And the other reason why it's so much more fluid is that they didn't have that distinction. There was no, as we've just been talking about, there was no Royal Navy for the Kingdom of Jerusalem. There were merchant ships, but a merchant ship, it's not like that you need big cannons. It wasn't an artillery kind of piracy. You basically just needed a big ship with a lot of men on it who wanted to do some fighting. So you find that those same ships do everything. If you've got a big ship in the port of Acre, the king might hire you to take part in a siege one day. The following day, you might be loaded up with wine and going back to France, the other way around, coming from France, hopefully with lots of very nice wine, and then maybe taking people or other goods back. And then the day after that, you might be sailing out on your own and you come across a ship that looks like it's easy pickings, so you take it. I mean, I think that the only reasonable definition of a pirate in the medieval world is, a man with a ship and an opportunity. It's just that simple.
It is, though. It is. I mean, When you have these images of pirates from later history, they always have a flag that tells you this is a pirate. They're coming after you. But It's absolutely unclear. And it's one of these things which is so related to what you're saying is happening on land as well, because you have people that are protecting their merchandise. So they fill their ship with people who are armed to the teeth, and then they set them out on the water. And then you have all these people who are armed. They're like, well, here's another boat. We could just take their stuff because we have all these weapons with us. Why not? Yeah. So it's just one of these things that just easily escalates because of sort of the nature of what's going on there.
It is actually very similar to some aspects of private equity nowadays. It's kind of, they call it buy and build strategies. You build up a business and it takes over others. I mean, it is the kind of raw version of that on the sea. I mean, there was one incident where, and this was a time, it's very, very early on in the Crusader states where Tyre, which is now in sort of Lebanon, but in those days was in the Kingdom of Jerusalem. It was still occupied by the Egyptians. So a big Egyptian fleet sailed from the Nile to resupply Tyre. You've got to think, Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem has no navy, Egyptian navy, big, and it's sailing up the coast. And this Egyptian navy is clearly scared. The whole squadron, probably about 35 ships, and they sail up to Tyre, where they've got lots of provisions and, garrison, more reinforcements and so on. And then on the way back, they're so scared that the bigger ships, they deliberately leave the bigger ships behind in the convoy because they can't sail as fast, because they're desperate to get away from what? I read this. Well, the first time I read it, I thought, well, what are they frightened of? What are they getting away from? There's no navy to attack them. But then you read the story of what happened and you realize, so these two huge ships at the back, which have got nearly 1,000 men on board. I mean, these are massive. They get up to the port of Acre, which is in Israel now. And the local Frankish settlers see them coming. And instead of being scared, as in, here's the Egyptian navy with 1,000 Marines on board, they're rubbing their hands. And within minutes, 3 galleys and hundreds of Franks are out there chasing these regular ships in the Egyptian navy. And they capture one and they take the men prisoner and so on and capture the ship. And the other Egyptian ship tries to get away. And at that point, the Franks send messengers back when they're putting their wounded on shore saying, come on, lads, there's easy pickings here. So another 2 galleys appear and start the fight. And then about an hour later, 2 more ships join them. So at any given point, you can sail down the coast one afternoon and there is going to be 7 pirate ships with several hundred people all just hanging around, clearly had nothing better to do than go out and attack a professional navy. So it's no wonder the Egyptian navy was sort of scared, because there was, the whole coast is full of nutcase pirates who were prepared to go, and they were good at what they did. And it really explains an awful lot of why the Crusaders didn't need a navy. They had plenty of homegrown nutcases doing the same thing for them.
You can just hire one. They're cheap. They're cheap. Just say, like, whatever we capture, you get some of it, and that's going to be enough. to do it.
Often they're free. You basically just give them, well, you don't even need to give them permission. They just do what they do. You try and make sure they don't kill too many of the Christian people and make sure they're trying to get for Egyptian ones. But yeah, ultimately, it's a self-funding navy. It's a private enterprise navy.
It is the Wild East. Okay, so we are going long, but we have to go long because we need to get to the point where we're talking about gangsters that are also POWs, because this is the other sort of surprising part in your book. So here we are in Cairo, for example. We have all these Christian POWs and they start up a mafia. What happens?
I know, it's fabulous. I thought I was misreading it at first. When I was a kid, there was an American TV program called Hogan's Heroes, where the conceit is that these are American and British prisoners of war in Germany. And the conceit is that they're much more clever than their captors, and they eventually effectively take over the operation and treat it as a kind of semi-criminal operation. And it's a bit like Top Cat. It's that whole thing of, or Brer Rabbit. There's a classic storyline there about people in adversity turning things on their head and finding freedom through this slightly dodgy or very dodgy kind of gangsterism. There's a lot of, I guess there's Robin Hood and, that kind of thing. And bizarrely, it's a true story in the Crusades. You find this thing where in Cairo, there are so many prisoners of war and they get put in prison because actually Egypt is one of the few places that does have a bit of a criminal justice system because they're rich enough to do it. And also because a lot of their troops are slave soldiers. So Mamluk slave soldiers means that you get a lot of very tough guys there and they don't all want to be there. So you have this thing where these prisons were originally set up to hold Muslim soldiers, actually. But then in the course of the Crusades, you're getting so many prisoners coming in that more and more European or Byzantine or Christian Arab prisoners are put there. And some of these guys were there for 30 or 40 years. Extraordinary stuff. And over time, so it's a funny combination where the condition you have to have is that you have to have a society that's rich enough to have prisons, but is not rich enough to control them fully. So these prisoners are basically like indentured servants. I mean, they're kind of slave prisoners, indentured servants. It's all of that. And they're let out during the day to do building work. And you can still see that in a couple of the medieval buildings in Cairo, where there are traces of European architecture. So these guys were out doing all the kind of things that you get slaves to do because they're cheap and most normal people don't want to do them. Slaves don't have a choice. So these POWs were used as kind of slaves. But that kind of society didn't have the means of controlling them particularly. So these guys would go out every day. And you begin to find that things are going wrong because you do get records of prison governors saying, guys, we're going to have, really telling all the warders to make sure that the prisoners shave because they're looking too local. You can't tell the difference between the prisoners and the locals. So they're all fairly shabbily dressed and their skin is quite dark. A lot of them were, presumably Arab Christians anyway, or Armenians. And as they grow beards, it's very hard to tell who are the prisoners, who are the building workers, who are the civilians and so on. And over time, it gets looser and looser. So you find this whole Frankish communities building up and they still call them Franks. And it goes on for over 100 years. I think we're into the 15th century before people stop talking about local Franks and the local Frankish community, which is bizarre because you'd think, okay, well, if you were a prisoner and say you got captured in 1291, the Crusade, that's the end of the Crusades really in that area. And say you were 25 when you were captured. I mean, I'm not very good at maths, but you're not going to see old age and you're definitely not going to see the 15th century. So something weird is going on. But actually what happened was they were marrying local Christian women. There are a lot of Christian women there, the big, Coptic community. So you find they effectively built their own district. And it is a kind of sweet and sour kind of story of redemption and bravery in a very mafia sense. You're a kind of beleaguered community. You're in a foreign environment. You concentrate on doing the things that society frowns upon, but they secretly want. So just as, in The Godfather, they're running alcohol and, they're bootleggers and maybe they're doing drugs later and prostitution and so on. You find that's exactly what the Crusaders end up doing there. And they have a reputation for controlling drugs and women, but mostly it's alcohol. And it's a natural fit because the local Christian community are allowed to drink alcohol and they have production of alcohol. And you've got these big, butch prisoners of war. Again, we're back to our old demographic. They're no longer young, but they are serious guys who've had military training. They've now been working on a building site, huge rocks being carried everywhere. So they become gangsters. And you do find this, it's extraordinary that it is like Hogan's Hero on a macro scale. I'd like to think that the writers of Hogan's Hero came across this before I did, but I doubt it. But it does show that it is, in humanity, there's only a certain number of permutations. So it is Hogan's Hero in Cairo. And
it's funny because of course, the first thing you can do is bootleg wine in a community that's not supposed to have it. Of course, it makes so much sense.
yeah, that's your leverage, really. And actually, the Mamluk soldiers, these are not theologians. They all want a glass of wine. Actually, a lot of the bureaucrats were still Christian anyway. So, there's a big trade there. And you also find that sometimes that they're absolutely protected by the guys at the top as well.
Yeah.
So I'm reading between the lines. I'm maybe cynical, but I think there was money changing hands as well as they were paying protection money.
Yeah, I think if you didn't sort of suspect that, I would be worried about your scholarship, and I'm not. So I think that I think that it's something that definitely smells funny, really when you have the people at the top who are on the take.
Getting strangely rich, and absolutely.
Yeah.
And they're issuing edicts saying, "Don't mess with my boys." It's like, well, how are they your boys? It's
aren't these prisoners? Yeah, no,
I think so.
Well, thank you so much, Steve, for putting this human phase and also this big anthropological phase on this part of history that is just so complex and messy and just fascinating. Thank you so much, Steve, for coming on and talking to us about Crusader Criminals.
Thank you, Danielle. You've been wonderful as always, of course.
Thank you. To find out more about Steve's work, you can visit his webpage at stevetibble.com. His new book is Crusader Criminals, the Knights Who Went Rogue in the Holy Land. Before we go, here's Peter to tell us what's going on medievalist.net. What's up, Peter?
Hey. So we have news about how Roland's sword has gone missing again.
Uh-oh.
So news came out that in Roquemondor, France, someone has stolen the legendary sword of Roland, Durandal, which is just kind of put into a wall in the kind of open area in the town. It's a very popular tourist attraction. People go and look at this sword, but someone seems to have snuck away with it. But we have a piece by Katrina Ogdarnik-Kujic about that and how it's not the first time this sword's gone missing. In the 12th century, the young King Henry took off the sword and like any other relics he could pillage in the area. He had to fight his dad, Henry II. So not bad taking the sword for that reason, right?
Sure. Yeah. Sure. I'm sure that's what Roland would want.
So we've got news about that. Plus, there was a fire at Rouen Cathedral yesterday. It was only slightly damaged to its spire. It was already undergoing construction work, so I think that's what happened. So we have that. Plus, there is a conference taking place here in Toronto next month on Christine de Pizan.
I know. I was so excited. I don't know yet if I'm going to be able to go to it or not, but I love that there's a conference on Christine and that it's here at University of Toronto.
Yeah. We're very lucky that University of Toronto is like a real hot spot for medieval studies. So yeah, if you're a Christine de Pizan fan, head off to Toronto.
Yeah. Are you going to be posting about that so people can find out more information?
Yeah, we have a post about that on our site, and I'm looking forward to it. I think I'll go too.
Awesome. Yeah, it's going to be great. I really hope to go. I hope that there's going to be lots of interest because Christine is just amazing.
Indeed. So we got all that and much, much more on the website.
Well, thanks, Peter, for stopping by and letting us know.
Thanks.
Thank you to all of you who are out there supporting my work, whether it's letting the ads play through, recommending my podcasts and books to your friends, or joining medievalist.net's Patreon page. Patrons have a special place in my heart because it's your patronage that allows me to keep this podcast going. So thank you. If you'd like to become a patron, please visit patreon.com/medievalists. And if you'd like everyone to know you're a medieval fan, you can visit tpublic.com/stores/medievalistsnet to pick up some sweet medieval merch, including shirts with my super awesome logo on them. And if you do, take a picture and tag me on social media so I can say thank you. For everything from the criminal to the liminal, follow medievalist.net on Facebook or X at Medievalists. You can find me, Danièle Cybulskie, across social media at 5MIN Medievalist or 5-Minute Medievalist. And you can find my books at all your favorite bookstores, where you can get hold of Chivalry and Courtesy, Medieval Manners for a Modern World, now out in hardcover, ebook, and audiobook. Our music is Beyond the Warriors by Guy Frog. Thanks for listening, and have yourself an amazing day.